You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 8th of May 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. It's 1400 in Beijing, 9 a.m. in Jerusalem, 7 a.m. here at Midori House in London, and 2 a.m. in Washington, D.C. You're listening to Monocle Radio. The Globalist starts now. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up,
I reiterate my appeal for both parties to show the political courage and spare no effort to secure an agreement now.
The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres there will have the latest on the international attempts to bring about a ceasefire in Gaza as Israel continues its military operation in the southern city of Rafah. Also coming up, Russia says it'll hold nuclear weapons drills. Moscow claims it's in response to the West stepping up support for Ukraine. NATO calls the move irresponsible. We'll have more. And after Paris, China's president heads to Belgrade. Our Balkans correspondent Guy Delorney will join me to explain why Xi Jinping has chosen to head to Serbia. Also ahead,
they become mouthpieces or spokespersons for a certain conservatism that is predicated on them being gay Republicans. But they're there usually to speak about placing limits on the LGBTQ rights movement as it is today.
We'll hear about a new book coming out, Republican, A History of the Gay Right. Plus our paper review will come from Istanbul, and we'll ask why Germany's Chancellor is getting a grilling over the price of a doner kebab. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. 3 men accused of killing a Canadian Sikh leader have appeared in court. The death of Hardeep Singh Nijjar last year triggered a diplomatic crisis between Canada and India. The porn star at the centre of Donald Trump's first criminal trial, Stormy Daniels, has given a detailed account of their alleged sexual encounter in 2006. And one of the world's oldest men's clubs, the Garrick in London, has voted to allow women to join as members. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, Israel has said its military operation in Rafah will continue until Hamas is eliminated or that the remaining hostages are released. The UN has urged Israel and Hamas to show political courage needed to agree a ceasefire after Israeli forces seized control of the Gaza side of the Rafah border crossing yesterday. I'm joined now by Nimrod Goren, who's Senior Fellow for Israeli Affairs at the Middle East Institute and the founder of the Israeli foreign policy think tank Mitvim. A very good morning to you, Nimrod.
Good morning.
So let's just get the latest on what is happening in Rafah, if you don't mind. Israeli forces say that they now control the main border crossing between Egypt and southern Gaza. This effectively shuts down a vital aid route into the Strip, doesn't it?
It was a limited operation in the eastern part of Rafah that actually was designated specifically for taking over the crossing because of concerns that Hamas has been utilizing the crossing to empower itself. This apparently was coordinated with the Americans and probably also with the Egyptians. There are now reports about an American private company that may take over the operation of the crossing in order to enable the continuation of flow of humanitarian aid in a way that ensures that it goes to those actually in need. And the conversation is now whether this operation will continue. Israel says that if negotiations on a ceasefire do not succeed, the military will go on further towards Rafah. The Americans are pressing against it, and the delegations of both Israel and Hamas are separately in Cairo trying to somehow maybe make progress on what many people want to see.
Nimrod, tell us a little bit more about this US involvement with aid supplies and any control of border crossings here. How has that been received?
It's new. I think it's received also in line with what the Americans are trying to do in setting up their pier near Gaza. So basically we see the US stepping up its role in actually managing some of the daily administrative tasks related to the flow of aid into Gaza. It's doing it through private companies, so that's interesting. In the past, when there was an Israeli withdrawal from Rafah, the one who took over the crossing was EU-BAM, basically the European Union force. That didn't go that well at the time. It also reflects that there is no current arrangement for another Palestinian leadership or a regional actor that can step in. And that's a vacuum. The fact that the Americans are doing that, I don't think it's sustainable for the long term. At the moment, it's a very good short-term solution for everybody because it doesn't mean that Israel is controlling the crossing de facto in its operation, and it will allow a continuation of some flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza.
How much is this connected to the warning that the United States gave that any military operation conducted by Israel in Rafah had to be backed up with sufficient humanitarian support? I mean, is the fact that the United States is involved now, does that suggest perhaps that it doesn't trust Israel?
This is an issue that has been debated between the US and Israel very openly over the last few months in the media. We heard statements about it coming from officials. We saw the disagreements in daylight. It's not always happening in Israel-US relations. We saw the delegations coming back and forth to try and find a modality in which Israel can carry out actions in Rafah that support its war objectives, but in a way that do not cause much damage or harm or cross the red lines, both of the US and Egypt. The Americans described it as their opposition to a major ground operation. So there have been attempts to find out what could be another alternative for an act that is not a major ground operation. What was done around the crossing could have been a solution to that if it stopped there. If there will be a continuation of the Israeli operation in Rafah, I think the American opposition will be stronger. And we already saw indications about the stopping of weapons supply. Those are things that were in the media some days or weeks already, but now it's being publicly shared by American officials. That is a sign of what may happen next, as the US is very much still involved in actual diplomacy and mediation in Cairo. So all that is happening around Rafah, I think, are leverages to try and push the sides to agree on something in the talks in Cairo.
Let's move to the talks in Cairo. We have a state of the moment, as you have just described, Israel is fighting, but it's also talking at the same time. It has a mid-level delegation in Cairo, and the aim is to study the Hamas proposals, but that delegation has no mandate to negotiate, does it?
It's limited, and that's, again, a debate, an internal Israeli debate about how much Netanyahu is really dedicated and motivated to actually reach a deal, and there's a debate about that. There has been criticism about not sending high enough level of officials to these talks or giving them enough mandate. But overall, these are maybe the optics, because there are people from both sides, the Israeli and the Hamas side, at the same time in Cairo. This is something that didn't happen in a while. For some weeks, it was like a back and forth. Some groups were meeting, devising a plan, going to the other, waiting for a week, studying the reply. So it was a very slow-paced negotiations. Now there is a sense of urgency. We saw what happened a few days ago when there was an expectation or a hope that Hamas agreed to the mediator proposal. There was some confusion there, but the reaction of both Israelis and Palestinians on the streets showed that the public really wants to see some progress. The zone of the possible agreement is limited. Netanyahu does not want to stop the war. I think most of the Israelis do not agree to stopping the war, but in terms of a first phase in which there is increased humanitarian aid, there is release of some hostages, there is release of Palestinian prisoners, and there is ongoing negotiations about the next phase, I think that's something that both sides can agree to if diplomacy becomes more effective.
I mean, how genuine is that sense of urgency that you described? Because you mentioned a moment ago that the public wants to see movement on both sides. And indeed, time is something that those hostages in Gaza do not have, nor do the Palestinian citizens trapped.
Exactly. So eventually there are people on the ground and people in the captivity that are suffering from the continuation of the war. And then there are the big political and geopolitical considerations, and they are not always aligning, especially the different actors have different political timelines. And we know American elections are drawing near, and that impacts calculation. We know that Netanyahu is fighting for his political survival in Israel, and that impacts some of the decisions being made. So therefore, if we limit a bit the scope of the negotiations to what could be agreed upon, the sense of urgency there is very big, because Hamas, 3-4 months ago, when the discussion about a temporary pause was beginning, we were speaking about the release of 40 Israeli hostages from a humanitarian category in phase one. Now, Hamas is saying that it doesn't even have 33 of them alive anymore. So the numbers are decreasing day by day. and Israelis do not have the reliable information about how many of these hostages are actually still alive. And when you do not have the information, it leaves space to a lot of disinformation and spin and leaks and political maneuvering. So having more information about what's it actually being negotiated about could enable, I think, the public to better press for the reasonable solution that could be agreed. When nobody knows what you will get out of the negotiations, everybody can play from their positions.
What we do know is that Hamas says that if Israel continues its campaign in Rafah, there will be no ceasefire.
Yes, but then there is an Israeli position that says that if Israel goes to Rafah, it means that the negotiation failed and Hamas did not agree. So again, you have both sides that are not seemingly so eager to make the concessions that are needed to reach the deal at the moment. You have the group of mediators, it's Egypt, it's Qatar, it's the US that are investing their efforts to that. Currently, they did not manage, I think, to flex the sides enough. Each time over the last few months, the blame was put on someone else. In some of the weeks, it was put on Israel. On some of the weeks, it was put on Hamas. So again, it seems like there's a bit of confusion on how this process is managed and how it's being transmitted to the publics. And I think we need a bit more clarity on what is actually going on. Why did efforts fail until now? What is on the table at the moment? Who is saying what? Of course, negotiations are held behind closed doors, but this has a very clear public diplomacy dimension to it. And I think someone should take care of providing information that both sides can trust and shape their positions and discourse around.
Very briefly, Nimrod, you talked about the public sense of sort of coherence, but what about the internal sense of coherence from those trying to bring about peace, from the head of the CIA, from the Egyptians and from the Qataris? Are they together?
Seemingly so. We saw all kind of changes with the process. At times there were more criticism of Qatar, and recently Egypt took a more prominent position. A few days ago, when there was this Hamas announcement on accepting a proposal, initially people thought it was an Egyptian Qatari move that the US may not have been coordinated enough on, but then it may not be the case. We know Bill Burns was in Qatar and maybe was involved in that and was in the know, was in the loop. So it seems like the current mediators are actually working somehow together. The question is whether it's enough, whether maybe there are other actors that can contribute, not replacing, but can contribute to mediation. Where are, for example, Palestinian voices that are not Hamas, the Palestinian Authority? What does it think about the deal that is proposed to the Palestinians? Is it a good one in their eyes or not? That's a voice we didn't hear. Jordan in the past was very helpful in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. So there are maybe other actors who can somehow contribute, but eventually I think the Americans and the Egyptians have always been the key players in such negotiations and should have the leverage to make them succeed.
Nimrod Gorin, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. You're listening to Monocle Radio. 9:13 in Moscow, 7:13 a.m. here in London. Now, Russia says its troops are to carry out drills to practice for the possible use of nuclear weapons on the battlefield. The exercises will be held near to the border with Ukraine and are, according to Moscow, a warning to the West about its involvement in helping Kyiv. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined by Jenny Mathers, who's a senior lecturer in international politics at Aberystwyth University. I'm delighted to say she's in the studio. Very good morning to you, Jenny. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you.
Right, just explain to us, what do we know about these drills? I mean, what do they look like? Who's involved in them?
So these drills are different from the strategic nuclear drills because the strategic nuclear weapons are basically at high combat readiness. But for tactical nuclear weapons, they have to do a lot more to pull them all together. So we're going to see a lot more activity. So things being taken from the warehouses, different components being put together. So there's going to be a lot more busyness around it, which I think actually is part of the signal that Putin wants to send. He wants there to be a visible series of actions to back up his rhetoric. And this is a way of saying, look, we're serious with, to the West, back off, stop what you're planning to do and think again.
What kind of missiles would they be launching and where?
Well, the idea is that these are tactical nuclear weapons. So in theory, they are suitable for use on the battlefield. They're meant to have a low yield. They're meant to only affect a small area. Now, this is a bit of a nonsense, really, because any use of nuclear weapons at any level, any size, is going to be absolutely catastrophic, and we don't know where it would lead. And so, yes, there is a bit of a fiction about making this distinction between what is tactical and what is strategic. But nevertheless, the idea is that Russia could choose to use these basically in Ukraine to have a relatively limited impact.
What would Russia, I think we could probably more specifically say, what would Vladimir Putin consider to be a red line that would prompt the use of such weapons?
Well, his red lines have shifted a lot over the past 2 and a bit years. So it's gone everything from, the West supplying tanks to Ukraine, which clearly that's already happened, to various kinds of missiles, which has already happened, to F-16s, which is happening. And now it's really saying that, the West should not be giving a green light to Ukraine to use Western-supplied weapons against the territory of Russia, but also, sort of pushing back against Macron's recent statements that, perhaps NATO member states would have to provide troops on the ground. So it's really, we don't know what the red lines are, basically. But what he wants to do is to continue to use these threats of nuclear weapons, which he has been using throughout, to tell the West, back off. The risk is too high. I might just do this. You don't know. I'm unpredictable. So don't go anywhere near where you think my red lines might possibly be.
There is some diplomacy going on behind the scenes. The fact, the purpose of this is, the back off message. But the United Kingdom's, I think the British ambassadors to the foreign ministry has been hauled into Moscow to warn that if UK supplied weapons are used in strikes on Russian territory by the Ukrainians, that there will be some sort of retaliation to this. Where does this fit in the nuclear element, or is this a separate problem?
I think the lines are definitely blurred, and they're deliberately blurred. Because when a state makes a claim that, there will be consequences to this action or that action, they tend deliberately to leave it unspecified, to give themselves the maximum amount of flexibility, but also to allow that imagination among their opponents to do its work. And so we can just imagine what could Putin think of doing to the UK, and it can range anything from, slapping on economic sanctions, throwing out a few diplomats, or, nuclear weapons use. Who knows? So this is deliberate. It's part of the messaging. It's part of the overall positioning and posturing that Putin is making, really to try and decrease support for Ukraine from the West.
And the fact that this announcement or these rumblings have arrived around the same time as Putin's re-election parade, is there a coincidence there, or is there something a little bit more thought out?
I think that there are a lot of things reinforcing each other. All right. So Putin has just been re-inaugurated again for the 5th time. We've got, Victory Day celebrations coming up tomorrow, marking the anniversary of the end of the Second World War. And we've got, responses to all of these moves and rhetoric on the part of Western countries. So I think a lot of things are building up and sort of contributing to each other.
And also another piece of the jigsaw is the presence of Xi Jinping of China in Europe this week, in Paris, in Belgrade, and then he goes off to Hungary afterwards. China has pledged a no-limits alliance with Russia. What influence could Xi have, or just explain the timing a little bit more about the significance of this visit and what the effect it could have with Putin?
Right. So, Xi's visit, I think, is really important in terms of how we see China developing its relationship with Russia, how we see China as a key figure in relation to the war in Ukraine. So China wants to make sure that its position is maximally flexible, right? So it's providing a lot of support for Russia behind the scenes in terms of weapons components or components that can be used in weapons, in terms of diplomatic cover. But it's also taking a big advantage of Russia in terms of, buying Russian energy at knockdown prices. And really, China definitely has the upper hand in this relationship with Russia. So as far as China is concerned, it would be embarrassing and humiliating if Russia were to lose in Ukraine. But on the other hand, China is almost certainly a restraining force and would certainly not be happy if Russia were to use nuclear weapons.
Just going back to the nuclear weapons issue internally within Russia, are there any cool heads in the Kremlin that could actually ensure that no button is pushed?
That's really hard to say, because what we've seen over the past couple of years is basically the elite in Russia who have chosen to stay and support Putin have, put all of their coins in the piggy bank of Putin's rhetoric. And so we don't see any visible distinctions, I don't think. We don't see any big significant breaks within that elite. However, if it came to it, if it really did come to a moment when he looked as though he was going to take this step, which would be totally unprecedented and take us into completely unpredictable territory.
That's something that we've seen before with Vladimir Putin.
Yes, that's true. I think, but if nuclear weapons were actually used by Russia, nobody really knows what the West's response would be. And I think that should frighten everyone, because it does take us into territory that we just don't know what it would look like.
While I've got you here, there's some news coming out of, there's an interview in the Financial Times today with the Lithuanian Prime Minister, who has said that she has parliamentary permission to send troops to Ukraine for training purposes. And this ties in a little bit into what Emmanuel Macron said about sending European soldiers to Ukraine. How would that change things?
I think, again, it's just another step in this, in this ladder where we started at the bottom rung, back at the beginning of the mass invasion when, no one knew exactly how far anybody was going to go. And gradually different supporters of Ukraine have emerged and have provided more and more support. I think this is just another step. And I think we will probably see more of this, particularly from the Baltic states, possibly from Poland, from those states that are closest, have had a very intimate relationship with Moscow in the past, which has not gone very well for them. And they have really good reasons to support Ukraine with everything that they have.
Jenny Mathers, thank you for joining me in the studio. Still to come on today's programme.
China and Serbia are celebrating their ironclad friendship. I'm Monocle's man in Belgrade, Guy Delaunay, and I'm following Xi Jinping's visit to the Serbian capital and chewing over what it means.
More from Guy a little later on The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me is Ruth Michelson on the line from Istanbul. Good morning, Ruth. How's Istanbul looking today?
Lots of news coming out of Istanbul. I fear if I say anything about the weather, we'll get into a standoff.
Not at all. We have deep mist here in London, but the promise of sunshine later. This is only interesting if you are in London, not if you're in Istanbul. OK, dive in with the papers. What have you spotted?
So all over the papers this morning is that there is an unknown Biden administration official talking to different newswires, the Washington Post, all kinds of outlets, discussing that the Biden administration has paused the shipment of several large weapons, including some 2,000-pound bombs to Israel, over concerns that they could be used in Rafah in southern Gaza. This was a decision apparently taken last week, but it seems to be leaking out now, which would seem to coincide with the fact that Israel has been scaling up attacks on eastern Rafah.
Tell us a little bit more about how the papers have reacted to this. We heard from Nimrod Goran a little bit earlier on about how, the United States is taking more of a direct involvement in what is going on. There may be a private company which is helping with the delivery of humanitarian aid and border crossings as well, just to make sure that what needs to be done in terms of humanitarian requirements is now done. Is there a sense that the United States is taking more of a direct approach here now because of because of pausing the shipments of these weapons?
I mean, there's a US official quoted in the Washington Post, this quote getting a fair amount of play, being also picked up by Reuters, saying that this decision to pause certain weapon sales, and also a reminder, they could resume them. This is just a pause. But that this decision they described as a shot across the bow. And this is one intended to basically show the Israeli authorities how serious US concerns are. But at the same time, senior Israeli official speaking to Reuters apparently wouldn't confirm that there's been any hold-up in arms supplies, and in the words of Reuters, appeared to take the reports in stride, telling them that, as the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had already said, if we have to fight with our fingernails, then we'll do what we have to do.
Let's move on to another story that was moving around yesterday. So let's see how the New York Times is covering it. Ukrainian security services said that they have foiled a Russian plot to assassinate President Volodymyr Zelensky. Perhaps there's no great surprise that might be happening.
I mean, I think the surprise here is the details that have come out about this, although there's also the detail that apparently the assassination was meant to be an inauguration gift for Vladimir Putin. So the Ukrainian security services, in the words of the New York Times, when there have been previous assassination plots, plural, as you point out, the Ukrainians didn't reveal a lot of detail. This time, the Ukrainian security services went to some length, issued this big statement, issued a video, basically to outline how these plots, the multiple plots, one targeting Zelensky, other targeting senior Ukrainian officials, were to be killed. I mean, one of them... there's a video from one of the men in the security services describing this incredibly detailed plot to kill Zelensky. And then there's another detail about this assassination attempt at one of the generals that involves targeting him with a rocket strike and then a drone attack that was designed to basically to blow up the evidence of the initial rocket strike and to kill people that would be coming to his aid.
And that's, of course, that level of detail is obviously a message sent to Moscow to suggest that actually everything that they do, people know about.
Well, yes. So in apparently part of the Ukrainian security services statement, they said, this was supposed to be a gift to Putin before the inauguration, and said that it was actually a failure of the Russian special services. So obviously, as you say, releasing all of these details is a way of saying, look what we found out that you were able to do.
Let's move on to another story now, also from the New York Times and the Washington Post. Its approach on how the fact that a couple of weeks ago a bill was passed in Congress in the US to effectively tell the company, TikTok's owner, to sell it or be banned. TikTok has now replied.
Yes, TikTok has replied by suing the US government. The New York Times points out that given the nature of this discussion, where essentially TikTok is saying, this law is potentially a violation of the First Amendment, this means that this battle is likely to end up in the Supreme Court. Mentioned by NBC News, for example, that the nature of this court battle is designed to delay and stall and maybe mean that the potential banning of TikTok, if the app fails to sell, that this would go way over this 270-day time limit, which I think goes into next January. And this court case then could drag that out even longer.
Let's move on to Disney. Its share prices have not done so well in the last couple of days. And what it is now doing is it's going to do less but better.
Yes, so this is all based on, I believe, an earnings call or a call to investors from Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney, where there's been lots of pickup about his comments, and you can tell me if you think these are contradictory. So he basically said that there'll be fewer Marvel films because Disney plans to release less and focus on quality. But then in the same, in the same call, he basically said that, their intellectual property is second to none, and then said that, all of the films that are about to come out are things like Inside Out 2 from Pixar, lots of follow-ups, lots of reusing of the intellectual property. And then he said there's a lot of value in sequels because they're part of known franchises.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because I think we've discussed several times on Monocle the fact that these enormous sort of movie making sort of factory approach to creativity. One wonders how helpful they are, because if you've missed the Marvel franchise and it's not your bag, then it kind of like rules you out from enjoying mainstream cinema, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, I think there's also, it creates this general dissatisfaction with people going to the cinema. Why bother to go to the cinema physically in general if everything is going to be repeats and repeats of the same intellectual property? So this idea from Bob Iger that we're all very invested in all of the sequels and follow-ups doesn't really sound like he's listening to the people that they actually want, which is the people willing to go and put their bums on seats inside cinemas.
I think we just want to go and watch something interesting. Finally, talking about repeats and repeats and repeats, it would be lovely to have a Monet in your house or a Renoir in your house. But there's a rather interesting market for fakes that's appeared on no less than eBay.
Yes, this is an interesting story in The Guardian about a specialist in authenticating artwork saying that she applied cutting-edge artificial intelligence technology to find fake Monets and Renoirs on eBay. Now, my question here is that why do you need an AI to identify that if somebody is selling a painting, advertises a Monet titled Forest with a Stream, priced at £477,000, why do you need an AI to tell you it's quite likely to be fake if it's being sold on eBay? Just a question.
We need AI for everything, don't we, Ruth? We can't make our own decisions. Ruth Michelson, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Istanbul. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. The time here in London is just nudging 7:31. A quick look now at the latest headlines. 3 men accused of killing a Canadian Sikh leader have appeared in court. The death of Hardeep Singh Nijjar last year triggered a diplomatic crisis between Canada and India. The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau claimed the Indian government had been involved in Mr Nijjar's killing, something India denies. The porn star at the centre of Donald Trump's first criminal trial, Stormy Daniels, has given a detailed account of their alleged sexual encounter in 2006. She also told the court in New York about the hush money payment she received, which prosecutors claim was covered up by the former president. North Korea's former propaganda master Kim Ki-nam has died aged 94. He spent decades leading efforts in the totalitarian state to build a personality cult around the ruling Kim dynasty, running the country's state newspaper and reportedly being drinking buddies with Kim Jong-il. And one of the world's oldest men's clubs, the Garrick in London, has voted to allow women to join as members. The change was approved at a meeting last night, lasting 2 hours, with just over half the members, who include judges, MPs and senior figures from the arts, voting to let women join the club, which was established in 1831. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. 7:32 here in London now. Having enjoyed the red carpet treatment of a state visit to France, China's president is on the move again, going to the next stage of his European tour, stopping off in Serbia. So let's get the latest now from Guy Delaunay, Monocle's Balkans correspondent. Good morning, Guy. I'm imagining you've clearly been waiting your whole professional life for this momentous geopolitical visitation.
Good morning, Emma, and good morning, everybody. Yes, it's a big occasion in Serbia. In fact, this is so important that it kicked Eurovision off the air last night. And the local folk I've been speaking to here are quite perplexed. They were in the middle of watching the semi-final of the Eurovision Song Contest last night on the main national TV channel RTS1. And then Xi Jinping's plane arrived in the middle of all this, and the Eurovision was kicked onto RTS2 quite unceremoniously. So people were a little bit unimpressed by that, I have to say. So I think that this visit is hotly anticipated by President Vučić and the other members of Serbia's government. But as for the other people in Serbia, perhaps they'd rather have their Eurovision.
Well, let's talk about what President Vučić is after. The poor people of the poor fans of Eurovision may have to wait for another evening. But this is what Serbia has been waiting for, isn't it? Because China is a rare friend.
Yeah, well, Serbia's got friends, but the problem is those friends can sometimes be a little bit on the bullying side of things. And this is the main issue that Serbia's got, is with the way the European Union, in particular, the United States also, talk to it about its relations with Kosovo. And Serbia's deep in its accession negotiations with the European Union, but one entire chapter of those negotiations, chapter 35, if you're interested, is to do with its relations with Kosovo. And we've just seen that change recently, so that in essence, Serbia doesn't have to recognise Kosovo's independence, but it has to go pretty much all the way up to that. And Serbia and Serbian people don't like that very much. So when you've got somebody like Xi Jinping arriving a delegation of 400 Chinese people, including business people, accompanying him, dozens of agreements to be signed between the two sides. This is a chance for Serbia, for President Vučić, to say, look, we've got other friends, quite powerful ones who aren't bullying us to do things that we don't want to do.
Indeed. I mean, where does this place the EU membership negotiations when you have this happening?
Well, the whole thing with the European Union and the Western Balkans, not just Serbia, I think that over the years, they've really failed to commit to the region and failed to show that they really, truly want the countries of the Western Balkans in the European Union. It's been a real problem because if you make a declaration like they did at Thessaloniki in 2003, that the Balkans belongs in the European Union, and then since then you've only had Croatia join and everybody else is stuck in some sort of accession purgatory, well, that's not a very good message to be sending across. So while these negotiations are continuing, it's harder and harder for people to believe that they're ever going to come to something. And you're seeing the approval rating for EU membership in Serbia now at about 40%, barely more than the number of people who oppose European Union membership. So that's where it stands. And I think this visit comes at a very interesting time. And it, once again, I find myself saying it should focus minds in Brussels, but perhaps it won't.
But from China's point of view, I mean, the visitation of the visit of Xi Jinping coincides with the 25th anniversary of the NATO bombing of China's embassy. 3 Chinese journalists were killed, and it seems their eyebrows were raised when the agenda was announced as France, Serbia, Hungary. This is China making a very strong statement as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, President Xi actually arrived 25 years to the day since that bombing. And while NATO has always insisted that the Chinese embassy in Belgrade was hit by accident, I don't think there was anything accidental about the timing of the arrival of China's president at all. And he made a statement that was put out. Well, there were a couple of things that were put out. There was an editorial in one of Serbia's biggest newspapers saying that China would never forget, Chinese people love peace, but would never allow such tragic history to repeat itself. So that did sound very much like a warning. And on arrival in Belgrade, another statement was put out attributed to Mr. Xi, talking about how the two countries, Serbia and China, share a sense of international justice and fairness and contribute to peace in the world. Once again, that's setting China and Serbia, okay, it's not perhaps the biggest partner for China to have, but these are two countries which don't think that NATO is the be-all and end-all of Euro-Atlantic security. And they're making a strong statement about that by the timing of the visit here, the size of the visit here, and the very fact that Mr. Xi is here at all.
Guy, your line is giving us a little bit of trouble, but we'll persist with you for just one extra moment. It's not just a sort of a symbolic alliance here. Serbia has very close economic ties to China, doesn't it? Especially when it comes to China's Belt and Road.
It does indeed. And the biggest symbol of that is the Belgrade to Budapest railway. That's being constructed. I've been on a bit of it with President Vučić and Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, a couple of years ago when they opened the first section. That's planning to be completed in the next couple of years. And this is being done with Chinese finance and Chinese engineering expertise. So that's the biggest sort of infrastructure project we've got here. There are others, though. There are roads, bridges, tunnels, and then there's investment in mining companies, in domestic appliances. Hisense opened a factory in Serbia last year. And I think with this delegation that's coming over with all these people in it, you're thinking, what new business deals are going to be struck between Serbia and China? For China, this is a good way into Europe. And the railway that we're looking at here eventually should link up to the port in Piraeus in Greece, which is run by COSCO, the big Chinese shipping company. And so that's obviously a way for China into Europe. Serbia very much part of it.
Guy Delorney, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. .39 in Zurich, 2:39 a.m. in Washington, D.C. Now, ahead of the U.S. elections later this year, Republicans have leaned into the culture wars by challenging school education around race and gender. Florida's Don't Say Gay legislation has been a particular focus And yet, despite these attacks, roughly 1/3 of the LGBTQ community in the US supports Republicans. Well, Neil J. Young is author of a new book, Coming Out Republican, A History of the Gay Right, exploring the contributions that gay Republicans have made to conservatism throughout history. And Neil spoke to Monocle's Chris Chermak, who began by asking him about the tension among gay Republicans between their private and public identities.
It's tension that they have with the relationship to the question of politics of identity. Are we gay Republicans, or are we Republicans who happen to be gay? And over this 70-year period that I trace, there's folks that come down on different sides of that question. Some of them say, no, we're gay Republicans. We believe in conservative principles, and we want the Republican Party to incorporate us and understand and, recognize us as gay Republicans. But a lot of them through the years said, this is something that's not that important. It's incidental. It's not a public identity that we need to make a big deal of. We just need to work for a country and a party that doesn't hold this against us. And I think that that's a tension that's never really resolved in the history that I'm writing about, and continues to be a tension we see among gay Republicans today.
To what extent is that also a function of whether they believe that government should be playing a role in this, that there is a role, or the government should get out of playing a role by legalizing? In other words, that politics plays a role, and that therefore who they are as a person is something that they need to speak openly about politically, regardless of the other conservative views that they hold.
That's a huge part of it. I mean, these folks don't tend to be advocates of rights-based politics in general, right? They think that the government should get out of the way. And so they don't see themselves in the tradition of the civil rights movement that's demanding that the government grant them rights. They just want the government to stop discriminating against them in housing or employment. Although, obviously, most of these folks were huge advocates of the right to marriage. And again, they saw that as the government shouldn't stop us from being able to get married. Not that the federal government necessarily needs to grant a special right for same-sex marriage.
One other trend that was interesting through this book is kind of the evolution, I suppose, from many gay Republicans being silent partners in the conservative movement, whether that was founding the new right back in the 60s and 70s, and then going kind of from that to almost the foregrounding of open LGBTQ critics within the Republican Party. To what extent you feel like gay Republicans have accepted their role and played along willingly with either being the silent partner or now being kind of the foil in conservative media?
In a lot of ways, they've accommodated themselves to the larger culture of the time. So, when we're talking about folks like Bob Bauman, Marvin Liebman in the 50s, or really in the 60s and 70s, helping William F. Buckley launch the most important organizations of the modern conservative movement. I mean, this is a period where most people are still in the closet. So it's not surprising that these folks, especially working in the halls of power, they're keeping that part of their life secret and hidden. Well, there's huge transformations in American culture and society through this period. And one of the biggest is the rapid pace with which Americans come to accept homosexuality over this time period. And gay Republicans really benefit from and exploit that transformation, and they use it to great effect in recent years, especially in conservative media, where they become mouthpieces or spokespersons for a certain conservatism that is predicated on them being gay Republicans, right? That they go on these Fox News and other conservative media spaces and they openly identify that the whole reason they're there is because they are gay Republicans or LGBTQ conservatives, but they're there usually to speak about sort of placing limits on the LGBTQ rights movement, of offering a conservative critique of much of the LGBTQ rights movement as it is today. So they've really done both, but I think it's in keeping with the larger cultural and societal trends of the times that they lived in.
One other interesting aspect about the motivations is you speak to a few who talk about kind of the importance of both political parties, all political parties for that matter, in the United States, supporting gay rights back in the day or LGBTQ rights today, and that's what keeps them involved in the conservative movement. I'm wondering to what extent you've found that is, a truth in the United States, that you're only going to have long-term rights secured when you talk about acceptance of homosexuality. Those kinds of rights are only going to be secured if conservatives back them at the end of the day. Until conservatives back them, it is a partisan issue that isn't really going away.
Yeah, this was one of the things that I thought was so fascinating to learn, especially in the early years when these folks are organizing into gay Republican clubs, mostly in California. This is in the 1970s. Their argument is we have to be in both parties. We can't let gay rights become a partisan issue. We have to show both parties, which at the time, neither of which were all that great on anything called gay rights, but that, we belong to both parties, that we're Americans, that we'll work through this two-party system to make gay rights not only a bipartisan issue, but hopefully a nonpartisan issue. I think that makes sense when we're looking at the 1970s and 80s. It makes increasingly less sense as this becomes such a partisan issue because Republican Party decides that an anti-gay politics in the 1980s and 1990s is a huge way in which it can attract a conservative base. And so gay Republicans arguing we need to work in this two-party system, the sort of rationale for that becomes increasingly strained. That said, almost all of the major legislative accomplishments I trace through this book, the two biggest ones being the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell and the legalization of same-sex marriage, they are accomplished because enough Republicans come on board to move those votes across the line, in example after example. So these gay Republicans through the years have argued, we're never going to become the dominant position of the Republican Party. We know that, but we can capture enough of a portion of the GOP that those folks can combine with Democratic legislators or Democratic voters at the local level to make gay rights happen. And I think that has actually been a successful strategy for them.
Well, and to follow up on that, what did you learn about kind of the breaking point that does exist for gay Republicans? At what point they might have said enough is enough for those who have left the party? And to your point about how that's shifted from the past to today, is there a worry there that the more that do break from the Republican Party, the less influence there is, and therefore the less we will actually move forward on some of these rights issues that are such partisan points today?
That's a constant concern. And one of the really important gay Republicans I interviewed who'd been really active in the organization in the 1980s and 1990s, the Log Cabin Republicans organization, which is the largest gay Republican organization, he told me, we have generational turnover. Every generation, there's a young, mostly, gay guy who grew up in a Republican family. He believes that he can be, and his generation can be the generation that changes the Republican Party. And so he gets active in this organization and in the Republican Party and gives it a go. And then eventually learns for whatever reason that things aren't going to change and he leaves. But there has been this sort of constant refreshing of the troops through the years. One of the most major, and I write about this at length, one of the most major points of rupture, though, for this history is the AIDS crisis of the 1980s, because it decimates, as it does in every gay community, it decimates the gay Republican clubs. And also those who survive are so horrified by what they see the Reagan administration doing or not doing in that case, and also the way that the Republican Party was weaponizing an anti-gay politics around HIV/AIDS, that this is a point where lots and lots of them leave the Republican Party. But again, there's a new set of guys in the 1990s who are young, who are post-Reagan babies, and they come in and they sort of take the movement over. And so it's a constant ongoing historical trend. I think right now we see those troops being refreshed quite amply in the era of Trump, which is a sort of interesting phenomenon in itself.
And just finally, one other aspect of that, when you talk about things that they don't necessarily talk about, is, I suppose, discrimination. I found that also an interesting aspect of this book, because it also goes to the heart of this conservative view of kind of rejecting activism for its own sake, seeking equal rights under the law, but not making LGBTQ, the movement, a never-ending project. And I suppose what the reason for that is, in their mind, almost discrimination does not count, or at least it's not something that needs to be discussed in the political sphere. Why is that? And is that also something that might, come back to bite them at some point?
Yeah, I think that that's something that just speaks to their generally conservative politics. Conservatives, especially in the U.S., don't tend to really focus much or believe that there's systemic discrimination in this country. And so, especially looking at this history, they tended to support things like ending city codes or state and local laws that allowed for employers to discriminate against gay persons. But there were a lot of gay Republicans who didn't even believe that that was a sort of legislative battle they should take up. Employers should be able to hire who they want to. And this isn't consistent with, I think, a conservative philosophy that they've shown. But I think, especially those who would declare the gay rights movement over, they would point to anti-discrimination laws that have been achieved and say, okay, those are in place. We don't need to worry about this. And we certainly don't need to be beating the drum about discrimination and I think that that's partly because they also don't, believe in things like institutionalized sexism or systemic racism. They don't have a broader vision of a system of discrimination and prejudice in this country. And I think, again, as white gay men, they've benefited from a larger cultural and political system that tends to work for them in general.
And that was Chris Chermak talking to Neil J. Leung, author of Coming Out Republican, A History of the Gay Right. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
1647 in Sydney, which is where we head now to talk fashion with Rebecca Tay, retail expert and brand consultant. Good afternoon, Rebecca.
Hi, Emma. How are you?
Very well, thank you. We have a little bit of an echo on the line, but we'll persist. Tell us, what news from fashion?
So the big news is obviously the Met Gala, which was last night. It's the big, sort of like the Oscars or the big party of the year every year in May for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's for the Costume Institute. Apparently this year's Met Gala raised $26 million for the Costume Institute, which apparently blew all the records. But the big show obviously is all the red carpet fashion. The carpet this year was actually green. It was sort of a nod to sustainability, and the theme, which was G. Ballard's short story from 1962 called The Garden of Time. And then the theme itself of the exhibition is Sleeping Beauties, Reawakening Fashion. So obviously kind of a nod to looking into the archives, trying to be a little bit more circular potentially, or think about sustainability in fashion and look into kind of the ephemerality of fashion itself.
And who are the big names in terms of who was designing this year? I mean, there was a huge presence of John Galliano.
Yes, there was. So John Galliano is the designer at Maison Margiela, which had quite an incredible couture show earlier this year. So there was quite a few celebrities dressed by him. Zendaya was a big name, I think, because she had 2 costume changes or 2 looks changes. One was by Margiela. But I think, it's not been unusual for celebrities to change dresses. So I was actually a bit surprised that she made such big waves, but she's quite big at the moment anyway, because she's in the Challengers movie, obviously. Loewe, also quite a big name on the red carpet. It's a title sponsor as well of the event, so that might partially be why as well.
And one thing that was quite interesting as well is that there were quite a few archive-inspired designs on the steps of the Met Gala. I mean, this is not unusual. We had this with Lagerfeld last year, but how much are people sort of celebrating archives?
I think it's sort of a nod to the fact that, fashion is one of the biggest kind of waste industries that there is. So I think the theme itself was trying to sort of address that. But then I think also celebrities sort of being people that we look to for inspiration or because they're so photographed, they do have quite a large voice. So trying to be a bit more conscious as well. So Demi Moore, for example, were addressed by the designer Harris Reed, who used archival wallpaper, interestingly. So it was really beautiful, kind of peony printed wallpaper for this amazing gown that she wore. Even brands like H&M, which dressed quite a few stars, looked into its archives, which they were saying from its when the house was founded in Sweden in 1947. So kind of lots of different versions of looking into the archives, I think, there.
Let's move on to another subject. Let's turn our focus to Paris. Obviously, the Olympics are looming large, but many Parisians, despite their disgruntled approach to it, that may change, are still very much focusing on fashion, which seems like a perfectly normal thing to do if you're in Paris.
Yes, doesn't it? I think it's, I think the Parisians especially are being very vocal about all the kind of traffic and construction that have already ground the city to a halt. But as you said, fashion is carrying on. So Couture Week is happening in the 24th to the 27th of June, which is less than a month before the Olympics kick off on the 26th of July. Men's Fashion Week has now just been confirmed as well. So a little bit earlier in June, 18th to the 23rd of June. But that's 70 shows all across the city again. And, with all the construction and kind of build-up that's happening, I think there's quite a lot of sort of furor that's happening around all the chaos that's about to happen, I suppose, this summer.
Indeed, logistically, how do they plan to pull this off?
Yeah, they're saying they're sort of saying clever scheduling and anticipation. They're saying there's going to be shuttle services. I think their wording is harmonization of the trajectories between the shows. So what exactly that means, I'm not sure. They haven't announced any, specific route changes or anything like that. So I think probably just working across the different federations and Olympics, the IOC potentially, and trying to manage traffic, I suppose, more than anything.
Rebecca Tay, thank you so much for joining us. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Finally, countries have various items which are used as a barometer for the cost of living. The price of a pint of milk, for example, here in the UK. And many nations also have dishes which all citizens should find accessible. The French have their pot au feu. So how a doner kebab has become a bellwether for Germany's ability to feed itself is anyone's guess, but it has. And there are calls now for the Chancellor Olaf Scholz to place an upper limit on its price. Well, Andrew Bulkley is a co-founder of 20% Berlin, a newsletter for Berlin's foreign population. I'm very glad to say he joins us on the line. A very good morning to you, Andrew. How's Berlin?
Hey, good morning. It's not dinner 30 yet.
Okay, fine. Wonderful. Just explain to us the popularity of the doner kebab. How has it reached such a status?
I think the doner kebab in Germany is really, it's Germany's Big Mac. It's kind of the one fast food that nobody admits to eating, but everybody actually eats. So it's a little surprised that people, when they see the price of the doner kebab going up, start complaining and criticizing politicians.
So just tell us a little bit more about its sort of journey to being rather an expensive thing to eat as opposed to being a sort of fast food staple.
Well, I think everything's expensive these days. I mean, McDonald's recently came out and said they're having trouble with earnings, and economists said it's because their food is too expensive, and so people are no longer going to McDonald's to eat. And so it's the same thing with the doner kebab. Doner kebab stands in Germany are kind of like McDonald's. They're on every corner. And when you think, I just want to grab something quickly to eat, you go to the doner kebab stand that's just, a couple hundred meters away. And so that's the first place you're going to see the prices growing. I think when you go grocery shopping, you're buying so many items, you notice that a couple of things are more expensive, but you've got bigger worries. But when you go buy a doner kebab, you're thinking, I've got €5 in my pocket. I can get a doner and a Coke, and this would be perfect. And then you go there, and €5 does not even cover a doner anymore. And so that's your only concern is now I can't eat.
I mean, how expensive are the kebabs now becoming? You mentioned, €5 used to get you a full tummy. That's not the case now. How much are you parting with?
Mine costs $7. I get a little bit bigger one than no normal person. And but you have your special stand. You know the guy. It's a little cheaper there, so it's going to work out. But yeah, they're between $5 and up to $10. There's a specialty dinner place in Berlin where they cost $15.
Gosh. So this is now becoming an enormously important topic when it comes to politics and the way that the Chancellor Olaf Scholz is managing the country and also its economy. It's overwhelming social media, at least, and now the mainstream.
Well, I think you're the only one saying that Olaf Scholz is managing anything at this point. He's pretty much the invisible chancellor. Nobody ever sees him. So when people do, I guess they scream out, "Hey, Olaf, make our donors cheaper." But that can only be about one person a day because nobody sees them. But yeah, this has long been sort of the satirical economic indicator in Germany, I think, for probably 10 years. People have used this. There's, of course, very famous. There's a Big Mac in the economic indicator where you can see how much a Big Mac costs around the world. And this whole point of let's put a ceiling on the cost of a dinner started last January when there was a campaign, a local campaign in Berlin, election campaign, and the SPD, the center-left SPD, said, "Hey, let's put a ceiling on doner kebabs." But nobody took it seriously at the time. It was a joke, and everybody handled it as a joke. And now Die Linke, who's sort of an insignificant party at this time, they're a far-left party, has said, "Yeah, let's actually really put a ceiling on it. We mean it sincerely. We're going to set aside 4 billion euros per year, and people can get cheaper dinners." But it's an insignificant party, but it's a good point.
It's an interesting point you raise there, insofar as that people still look to the government to rescue them financially when in times of real trouble here. The fact that they want government intervention when it comes to the price of food. I mean, that's quite a significant thought, isn't it?
I don't know that it's that significant. This is a fictitious inflation. It's based on corporate greed. It started off because we were going to have this energy crisis. It didn't happen. So now the only reason we have inflation is corporate greed. And who's the only person big enough to reel in corporations? That's the government. That's why the government's there. France has price caps on food. We subsidize all kinds of food at the production level. Why can't we subsidize food at the purchase level? Not every solution has to be a neoliberal solution.
And do you think that Olaf Scholz will actually respond to these requests to have a cap on the price of a doner kebab?
I don't think so. I think actually, I know this was in The Guardian yesterday. I think that was a very much clickbait. Nobody is taking a price cap on doner kebab seriously, but I think it will definitely cause more discussion about food costs.
Andrew Bulkley, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. You're listening to Monocle Radio, and that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to our producers too, Vincent McAviney, Carlotta Rebello and Monica Lillis. Our researcher was George Ruskin and our studio manager was Lily Austin. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing is live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.